She came to the graveyard to mourn her husband, but the moment a wounded, scarred German shepherd emerged from the fog and saluted the tombstone, everything she thought she knew about his death unraveled. The dog was supposed to be dead. In tags, said KIA, but what he carried in his mouth would open a deadly secret the military buried years ago, and now they were coming to silence them both. The morning mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, and Margaret Maggie Chen stood frozen at the edge of Section 7, her weathered hands trembling as she stared at the headstone that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. The black granite reflected her hollow eyes, and carved into its surface were words that still made her chest tighten. Staff Sergeant David Chen, beloved husband, died serving his country. She'd come here every month since moving to this godforsaken small town in northern Montana, always alone, always carrying the same wilted sunflowers David had loved. But today was different. Today she wasn't alone. The German shepherd emerged from behind a weathered oak tree like a ghost materializing from the fog. His coat was matted and dirty, ribs visible through patchy fur, but his eyes, those intelligent, amber eyes, held a depth that made Maggie's breath catch. He limped slightly on his left hind leg, and she could see old scars crisscrossing his muzzle, the kind that came from conflict, from war. "Hey there, boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. From disuse. She'd barely spoken to another soul in weeks. The dog approached cautiously, his head low, but his gaze never leaving hers. There was something about his bearing, the way he moved with purpose despite his obvious injuries, that reminded her of the military working dog she'd served alongside. In Afghanistan, the shepherd stopped 3 feet away and sat, his posture perfect despite his condition. Then he did something that made Maggie's heart skip. He raised his right paw and held it there waiting. It was a salute, a goddamn salute. "Jesus Christ," she breathed, dropping to her knees in the wet grass. "You're one of ours, aren't you?" The dog held the position for exactly 3 seconds, military precision, then lowered his paw and moved closer. When he was within arm's reach, he gently took the sunflowers from her trembling hands and placed them at the base of David's headstone. With the care of a pallbearer, Maggie's vision blurred. In all her years of military service, through firefights in Kandahar and convoy runs through hostile territory, she'd never felt more vulnerable than she did in this moment, watching a broken dog honor her dead husband with a dignity that most humans couldn't muster. "Where did you come from?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his scarred head. The dog leaned into her palm, and she felt the tremor in his muscles, the way he was fighting exhaustion and pain to remain standing. That's when she noticed the collar, nearly hidden beneath his matted fur. It was military issue, faded and worn, but still intact. With shaking fingers, she felt for the dog tags, and when she found them, her world tilted. The name etched into the metal made her stomach drop. Rex, MWD K9 Unit, KIA Afghanistan, 2019. Killed in action. But the dog was standing right in front of her, very much alive. The shepherd, Rex, watched her with those knowing eyes as she stared at the impossible dog tags. Then he did something that made the hair on her arms stand up. He turned toward the cemetery entrance and released a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry all the grief of every fallen soldier who'd never made it home. Other visitors to the cemetery stopped and stared, but Maggie barely noticed. She was too busy trying to understand how a dog that had been declared dead 5 years ago was now sitting beside her husband's grave, looking at her like he'd been waiting for her his entire life. As the howl faded into the morning mist, Rex stood and began walking toward the cemetery entrance. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back at her with an expression that was unmistakably expectant. He was waiting for her to follow. Maggie Chen had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, a divorce and the death of her husband. But as she stood in that cemetery with a ghost dog looking at her with eyes full of secrets, she realized her real war was just beginning. The drive back to her cabin was silent, except for the soft panting of the dog in her passenger seat. Rex sat with military bearing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Maggie kept glancing at him, trying to reconcile the impossible. She'd seen those dog tags in David's personal effects, had held them while the chaplain explained how her husband and his K9 partner had been killed by an IED during a routine patrol outside Kabul. They died together, Mrs. Chen. David was trying to shield Rex from the blast. Neither of them suffered. Lies. All of it had been lies. The cabin came into view, a weathered structure she'd bought with David's life insurance money, choosing isolation. Over the pitying looks of their friends back in Colorado, she'd needed a place to disappear, to drink herself to death in peace. Instead, she'd found a different kind of hell. Sobriety forced by loneliness, and memories that grew sharper with each passing day. Rex followed her inside without invitation, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. He moved through the space like he was conducting reconnaissance, checking corners, testing sight lines. When he reached the mantel above the fireplace, he stopped and stared. Maggie's heart clenched. The photo Rex was studying showed David in his dress blues, arm around a younger, smiling version of herself. They'd been married for 3 years when that picture was taken, full of plans for children and a future that had been obliterated by roadside bombs and military bureaucracy. He was a good man, she said, settling into the worn leather chair that had become her throne of misery. Stupid, but good. Always volunteering for the dangerous assignments, always trying to save everyone. Rex turned from the photo and approached her chair. For a moment she thought he might rest his head on her lap, but instead he sat at attention and began to whine, a low, urgent sound that made her skin crawl. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" The dog stood and walked to the kitchen, where he began pawing at the cabinet under the sink. Maggie frowned, following him. The cabinet held nothing but cleaning supplies and a bottle of whiskey she'd been saving for the day. She finally gave up completely. But Rex wasn't interested in the whiskey. He kept pawing at the back corner of the cabinet, whining more urgently. Maggie knelt and pushed aside the bottles, feeling along the cabinet floor until her fingers found something unexpected. A loose board. "What the hell?" She pried up the board and found a space underneath, just big enough to hold a small waterproof bag. Inside the bag was a letter, written in David's handwriting, and a small digital camera. "Maggie, if you're reading this, then I'm dead and someone has finally put the pieces together. I couldn't tell you while I was alive, they were watching, and I couldn't risk your life too, but I couldn't take the truth to my grave. What happened in Afghanistan, what really happened to Rex and the others, it wasn't enemy action. It was murder, and I have proof." Maggie's hands shook as she read the letter. David had discovered evidence of war crimes committed by their commanding officer, Colonel Harrison Maxwell, evidence that several soldiers and their K9 partners had been killed to cover up the theft of millions in reconstruction funds. Rex had been the sole survivor, hidden and nursed back to health by Afghan villagers who smuggled him to safety. I tried to get Rex home through official channels, but Maxwell's people intercepted every attempt. They want him dead because he's a witness. Rex saw everything, Maggie. He was there when Maxwell executed those soldiers. Dogs don't forget, and Maxwell knows it. I've been working with a reporter named Sarah Hendricks to expose this, but if something happens to me, you need to know. Rex is the key to everything. He's not just a dog. He's justice waiting to happen. The letter included coordinates for a safe house in Montana, instructions for contacting Sarah Hendricks, and a warning that Maxwell's people would stop at nothing to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Maggie looked up from the letter to find Rex watching her with those knowing eyes. He wasn't just a stray dog she'd found in a cemetery. He was a weapon, a witness, and a target. "You came looking for me, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew David was dead. You knew I was here." Rex stood and walked back to the mantel, where he sat beneath David's photo and released another low howl, this one filled with pain and rage and something that sounded like a promise. Maggie Chen had thought her war was over when she left the military. She'd thought her fight was finished when David died. But as she sat in her cabin with a ghost dog who carried the weight of murdered soldiers in his amber eyes, she realized she'd been wrong. Her war was just beginning, and this time she had an ally who would never retreat, never surrender, and never forget. Never forget. The next morning brought visitors Maggie hadn't expected. The black SUV with government plates pulled into her driveway at exactly 800 hours, and she watched from her kitchen window as two men in suits emerged. The shorter one was middle-aged, with thinning hair and soft features, but the tall one moved like military, spine straight, eyes constantly scanning for threats. Rex had sensed them coming before the engine sound reached Maggie's ears. He'd positioned himself by the front door, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. When the knock came, he bared his teeth. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Agent Collins with the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. This is Agent Rodriguez. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your late husband's service record." Maggie cracked the door, but kept the chain latched. "David's been dead for 3 years. What could you possibly need to know?" "We're conducting a routine review of certain incidents that occurred during his deployment. May we come in?" "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended, but something about Collins's smile made her skin crawl. It never reached his eyes. Rex pressed against her legs, his body tense as a coiled spring. She could feel his muscles bunching, ready to explode into action. Whatever he sensed about these men, he didn't like it. "Mrs. Chen, we understand you've been through a difficult time, but we really do need to discuss some discrepancies in the incident reports from your husband's final mission. It would be easier if we could—" "What discrepancies?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Collins's smile widened. "May we come in? This is a sensitive matter." Through the crack in the door, Maggie caught Rodriguez scanning her. Property, his hand resting casually on his jacket, right where a shoulder holster would be. These weren't investigators, they were hunters. "I don't think so. If you have questions about David's service, you can contact our lawyer." "We weren't aware you had retained counsel, Mrs. Chen. May I ask why?" Rex's growl deepened, and Maggie felt her military training kick in. Trust your instincts, trust your team, and right now her team was telling her these men were dangerous. "You can contact our lawyer," she repeated. "I'm sure you know how to find him." She closed the door and turned the deadbolt, her heart hammering. Through the peephole, she watched the two men have a brief, heated conversation on her porch. Collins kept glancing at his phone, and Rodriguez kept looking at the windows like he was planning entry points. After 5 minutes, they returned to their SUV, but they didn't leave. Instead, they parked at the end of her driveway and waited. "They're not going anywhere, are they?" she asked Rex. The dog had moved to the living room window, where he stood with his nose pressed to the glass, watching the SUV with the intensity of a sniper. Every few minutes, he'd release a soft whine, and Maggie began to realize he was communicating something she couldn't understand. The phone rang at 10:30 hours. Maggie almost didn't answer it, but the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Chen, this is Sarah Hendricks. I think your husband may have mentioned me." Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. The reporter. "Yes. I'm calling because I've been monitoring DoD communications, and there's been a lot of chatter about you in the last 24 hours. I think you need to know that Colonel Maxwell has been promoted to general, and he's been very interested in your activities lately." "My activities? I'm a hermit living in the middle of nowhere." "Mrs. Chen, do you have David's dog with you?" The question hit like a physical blow. Maggie glanced at Rex, who had turned from the window and was staring at her with those knowing eyes. "How did you—" "Because Rex has been MIA for 3 years, and suddenly Maxwell's people are scrambling to find him. They know he's alive, and they know he's with you. You're in danger." Through the window, Maggie saw Collins get out of the SUV and walk toward her mailbox. He was holding what looked like a small electronic device, and when he waved it near the mailbox, it beeped. "They're tracking something," she said into the phone. "They're at my mailbox with some kind of scanner." "His collar," Sarah said urgently. "Rex's collar probably has a GPS chip. They've been tracking him, waiting for him to lead them to you. You need to get out of there, now." Rex had already moved to the back door, whining urgently. Somehow, he'd understood the conversation, understood the danger. He was ready to run. Maggie's mind raced. She had David's truck in the garage, a go-bag from her military days, and enough cash to disappear for a while. But where could she go that Maxwell's people wouldn't find her? "Sarah, where are you?" "About 2 hours south of you. I have a safe house, but we need to meet somewhere public first, somewhere with witnesses. The diner in town, Mel's place, 1 hour. I'll be there. And Mrs. Chen, bring everything David left you. We're going to need it." As Maggie hung up, she watched Collins return to the SUV and make a phone call. Whatever he reported made Rodriguez slam his fist on the dashboard. "They know you're here, don't they?" she asked Rex. The dog's response was to walk to the closet, where she kept her service weapon, and begin pouring at the door. After 3 years of retirement, Staff Sergeant Margaret Chen was being called back to active duty, and this time she was fighting for more than her country. She was fighting for the truth. The escape from the cabin required every bit of tradecraft Maggie had learned in her military intelligence training. She'd slipped out the back door with Rex, while Collins and Rodriguez were focused on the front of the property, using the thick pine forest to mask their movement. Her truck was hidden in an old barn a quarter-mile away, a precaution that had seemed like paranoia 3 years ago, but now felt like divine providence. Rex rode in the passenger seat like he'd been born for it, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead. Twice he'd whined and pressed his nose against the window, and both times Maggie had spotted vehicles that didn't belong. A maintenance van parked where no maintenance was needed. A sedan with tinted windows sitting at an intersection with no traffic light. They were being hunted, and the hunters were getting closer. Mel's Diner sat on the main drag of Whitefish, Montana, a town small enough that strangers were noticed, but large enough that those strangers could blend in if they were careful. Maggie parked in the back and entered through the kitchen where Mel himself was working the grill. "Maggie Chen, ain't seen you in weeks. You look like hell." "Thanks, Mel. I need to use your office for a few minutes." "Private meeting." The old cook looked at Rex, who had positioned himself by the back door with perfect military bearing. "That's a hell of a dog you got there. Looks like he's seen some action, more than you know." Sarah Hendricks was already waiting in the office, a woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of intense eyes that came from years of chasing dangerous stories. She looked up when Maggie entered, and her gaze immediately went to Rex. "My God," she whispered. "David's photos didn't do him justice. He's beautiful." Rex approached Sarah cautiously, his nose working overtime. After a moment, he sat and offered his paw, the same military salute he'd given Maggie at the cemetery. "He remembers you," Maggie said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "Or he knows you're one of the good guys. David and I spent a lot of time together in those final months," Sarah said, gently shaking Rex's paw. "He was terrified of what would happen if Maxwell's people found out about our investigation. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find Rex and bring him home." "But Rex isn't just a dog, is he?" Maggie pulled out the letter David had hidden in the cabin. "He's a witness," Sarah nodded grimly. "Rex was with the patrol when Colonel Maxwell executed those 3 soldiers. He saw everything, the theft of the reconstruction funds, the murder of Staff Sergeant Williams, the cover-up that followed. Maxwell's people have been hunting him for 3 years because they know what he represents. A dog can't testify in court. No, but he can lead us to evidence. Rex knows where the bodies are buried, literally. He was trained to find explosives, but he's also been trained to find human remains. David believed that if we could find the real graves, we could prove that Maxwell's version of events was a lie. Rex had been listening to their conversation with the intensity of a soldier receiving a briefing. When Sarah mentioned the graves, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains in the distance. Then he began to whine, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every secret he'd been forced to keep. He wants to go back, Maggie realized. He wants to go back to Afghanistan. That's impossible. The area is still controlled by the Taliban, and even if we could get there, Maxwell's people would be waiting for us. Rex left the window and approached the desk where Sarah had spread out photos and documents from her investigation. He studied the papers like he was reading them, then carefully placed his paw on one particular photograph, an aerial shot of a remote valley in the Kandahar province. "That's where it happened," Sarah said softly. "That's where Maxwell killed those soldiers." Rex began to pace, his agitation growing. He went to the door, then back to the window, then to the photographs again. He was trying to communicate something, but Maggie couldn't understand what. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out a laptop. David wasn't the only one investigating Maxwell. There were others, journalists, military investigators, even some people inside the Pentagon. Most of them have been silenced, but I've been in contact with one source who's still alive. He's been feeding me information about Maxwell's current activities. The laptop screen showed a series of encrypted messages. As Sarah scrolled through them, Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. Maxwell hadn't just been stealing money in Afghanistan. He was still operating, still using his position to cover up war crimes and line his own pockets. "General Maxwell is scheduled to receive the Distinguished Service Cross next week," Sarah said. "The ceremony is at the Pentagon, and the President himself will be presenting the award. It's supposed to be for his heroic actions during the Kandahar offensive, the same offensive where he murdered those soldiers." Rex had stopped pacing and was staring at the laptop screen. As Sarah showed them photos of Maxwell in his dress uniform, the dog's hackles rose and he began to growl, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. "He recognizes him," Maggie said. "After all these years, he still recognizes. The bastard." "More than that," Sarah said. "I think he wants to face him." Rex's response was to walk to the door and begin scratching at it urgently. When Sarah opened it, he bolted into the diner's main room and headed straight for the front window. What he saw there made him release a howl that silenced every conversation in the restaurant. Maggie and Sarah rushed to the window and saw what had triggered Rex's reaction. A military convoy was rolling down Main Street, led by a black SUV that looked exactly like the one that had been watching Maggie's cabin. "They found us," Sarah said, but Rex wasn't looking at the convoy. He was staring at the man in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, a man in a general's uniform with silver hair and cold eyes. General Harrison Maxwell had come to Whitefish, Montana, and he'd brought an army with him. Rex stood at the window, his body rigid with fury, and Maggie realized that the dog wasn't just a witness to Maxwell's crimes. He was a weapon that had been waiting 3 years for the chance to strike back. The war was coming to them, whether they were ready or not. The diner fell silent as the military convoy pulled into the parking lot. Rex remained at the window, his body coiled like a spring, but his training held him in place. This was a dog who had been taught to wait for orders, even when every instinct screamed for action. General Maxwell emerged from the lead vehicle with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His dress uniform was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his smile held the warmth of a predator sizing up its prey. Behind him came a small army of soldiers and federal agents, their weapons visible but not drawn. "Back exit," Sarah whispered, but Maggie shook her head. "No, we run now. We'll be running forever." She knelt beside Rex, placing her hand on his scarred head. "Besides, I don't think he wants to run anymore." The dog's amber eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that made her heart skip. Recognition, not just of the enemy outside, but of her. Rex had been waiting for someone like her, someone who understood that some battles couldn't be avoided, only won or lost. Maxwell entered the diner with 2 agents flanking him, their eyes immediately scanning the room for threats. Most of the patrons were locals, ranchers, truckers, retired folks who'd seen enough of life to know when trouble walked through the door. They watched the general with the wary attention of people who'd learned not to trust authority. "Mrs. Chen," Maxwell said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "I'm General Harrison Maxwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Maggie stood slowly, her hand still resting on Rex's head. The dog remained motionless, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he was calculating distances and angles like the trained weapon he was. "General, I don't believe we've been introduced, and I'm quite sure I don't have anything that belongs to you." Maxwell's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "I think you do. That animal you're harboring is military property. He's been AWOL for 3 years, and it's time he came home." "Funny thing about that," Maggie said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "According to his official records, Rex died in Afghanistan in 2019. Hard to be AWOL when you're dead." A murmur ran through the diner. Mel had emerged from the kitchen, his massive frame filling the doorway, and several of the patrons had subtly shifted positions to get a better view of the confrontation. In a small town like Whitefish, everyone knew everyone else's business, and Maggie Chen was one of their own. "There was an administrative error," Maxwell said smoothly. "Rex survived the incident that killed your husband. He's been missing in action since then, and we've been searching for him ever since." "Is that so?" Sarah stood up, her laptop in her hands. "Then perhaps you can explain why your people have been trying to kill him for the past 3 years. Maxwell's attention shifted to Sarah, and his expression hardened. "Miss Hendricks, isn't it? The journalist who's been spreading lies about our operations in Afghanistan. I was wondering when you'd surface. The only lies being spread are the ones in your official reports, General. And I have proof." Rex chose that moment to move. He didn't attack. His training was too ingrained for that. But he stepped forward, placing himself between Maggie and Maxwell. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The dog was choosing sides. Maxwell's facade cracked for just a moment, and Maggie saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear. This man, who commanded thousands of soldiers and controlled millions in military funding, was afraid of a scarred German shepherd. "Stand down, soldier," Maxwell commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the military. Rex didn't move. He remained at attention, but his eyes never left Maxwell's face, and his position blocked any direct approach to Maggie. "I said stand down." The dog's response was a low growl that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. It was the sound of a soldier who had been pushed beyond his breaking point, who had finally found his enemy and would not be denied justice. "He doesn't take orders from you anymore," Maggie said quietly. "He never really did he? He was David's dog, David's partner, and David trained him to recognize the enemy." Maxwell's hand moved toward his sidearm, but before he could draw it, every man in the diner was on his feet. Mel had produced a shotgun from behind the counter. 2 of the ranchers had their hands on concealed weapons, and even old Pete Morrison, who had to be 80 if he was a day, was gripping a walking stick like a club. "I don't think so, General," Mel said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. "This is my place and these are my people. You want to start a fight, you'd better be prepared to finish it." The tension in the room was electric. Rex remained motionless, but Maggie could see he was ready to move. Whatever signal he was waiting. "For it was coming soon. This is a federal investigation," one of Maxwell's agents said, his hand hovering near his weapon. "We have authority here." "Not in my diner, you don't," Mel replied. "And especially not when you're threatening a gold Star Widow and her dog." Maxwell's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and rank, but he was outnumbered and outgunned by a room full of veterans and locals who didn't give a damn about his authority. "This isn't over, Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice low. "And dangerous. That animal is a threat to national security, and I will have him." Rex's growl deepened, and for a moment, Maggie thought he might break his training and attack. But the dog held his position, waiting for the order that would unleash 3 years of pent-up rage and justice. "You want him?" Maggie said, her voice carrying the steel of her own military training. "Come and take him." Maxwell stared at her for a long moment, then at Rex, who remained as motionless as a statue but radiated menace like a loaded weapon. Finally, the general turned and walked toward the door, his entourage following. "I'll be back," he said without turning around, "and next time, I won't be so polite." As the door closed behind him, the entire diner seemed to exhale. But Rex didn't. "Relax." He remained at the window, watching the convoy pull away, his body still coiled for action. "He's not done," Maggie said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Neither are we," Sarah replied, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. "I've been recording everything on this, and I'm uploading it to my secure server right now. The whole world is going to see what General Maxwell really is." But even as she spoke, Maggie knew that evidence and recordings wouldn't be enough. Maxwell had too much power, too many resources, and too much to lose. He would come back, and when he did, it would be with everything he had. Rex finally turned from the window, and when his eyes met Maggie's, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Anticipation. The dog wasn't afraid of Maxwell's return. He was looking forward to it. The confrontation at Mel's diner has revealed the true stakes of this deadly game. General Maxwell knows that Rex holds the key to exposing his war crimes, while Maggie and Sarah understand that they're fighting for more than just the truth. They're fighting for their lives. But Rex has spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and he's not the frightened survivor Maxwell expects him to be. He's a weapon of justice, trained by the best and tempered by loss. The safe house Sarah had arranged sat on 20 acres of Montana wilderness, far enough from civilization that screams wouldn't carry, but close enough to escape roots that they wouldn't be trapped. Maggie had spent the last 48 hours studying the intelligence Sarah had gathered, and each document painted a picture more horrifying than the last. Rex lay beside the fireplace, but his rest was fitful. Even in sleep, his legs twitched, and low whines escaped his throat, the sounds of a dog reliving nightmares that no animal should have to carry. "Tell me about the night it happened," Maggie said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "Tell me what David found." Sarah pulled out a thick folder, its contents organized with the precision of someone who knew that lives depended on getting every detail right. "Your husband wasn't supposed to be on that patrol. He'd volunteered to replace another soldier who was sick. If he hadn't been there, Maxwell would have gotten away with it completely. The 3 soldiers he killed, Staff Sergeant Williams, Corporal Martinez, and Private First Class Johnson, they'd discovered that Maxwell was selling weapons to insurgent groups. Not just small arms, but serious hardware. Anti-aircraft missiles, explosive devices, intelligence about coalition movements. They were going to report him. Rex's eyes opened at the mention of the names, and he lifted his head. The dog had been listening, understanding more than any animal should. When Sarah pulled out photographs of the 3 murdered soldiers, Rex approached and gently touched each picture with his nose, a gesture so human it made Maggie's throat tighten. "He knew them," she whispered. Rex was attached to Williams's unit. These weren't just soldiers to him, they were his pack, and Maxwell slaughtered them like animals. Sarah activated her laptop and pulled up a video file. This was recorded by Johnson's helmet camera. He managed to activate it before Maxwell's. People found them. The footage was grainy and dark, but the audio was clear enough. Maggie listened to the voices of young soldiers discovering evidence of treason, their excitement at potentially saving lives quickly turning to terror as they realized they were being hunted by their own commander. Then came Maxwell's voice, calm and authoritative, as he ordered their execution. "You boys have seen something you shouldn't have. I'm afraid this is where your service to your country ends." The gunshots that followed were precise, professional. Maxwell wasn't just a traitor. He was a cold-blooded killer who executed his own soldiers without hesitation. Rex had risen and was pacing, his agitation growing with each second of the recording. When Maxwell's voice filled the room, the dog's hackles raised, and he released a sound Maggie had never heard before, a mixture of grief and rage that seemed to contain the souls of every soldier who had died for Maxwell's greed. "There's more," Sarah said grimly. "The weapons Maxwell sold were used in attacks on coalition forces. 17 American soldiers died from IEDs built with explosives he provided. 34 more were wounded. He's directly responsible for the deaths of at least 20 American servicemen and women. Jesus Christ." Maggie felt sick. How did David get this evidence? Rex led him to it. After the murders, Maxwell's people tried to eliminate all witnesses, but Rex escaped into the mountains. The local villagers found him half dead and nursed him back to health. When David started investigating the discrepancies in the official report, Rex found him and led him to the real burial site. Sarah pulled up another file, photographs of a remote valley where shallow graves held the remains of Maxwell's victims. The images were brutal in their clarity, bodies that had been executed, not killed in combat. David spent months documenting everything, gathering evidence, building a case that would put Maxwell away forever. But Maxwell found out about the investigation and had David killed. The IED that killed your husband was remotely detonated. David knew it was coming. His final message to me was a warning that Maxwell's people had found him. He spent his last moments making sure Rex would survive to tell the truth. Rex had stopped pacing and was standing at the window, staring out at the forest. But Maggie could see his reflection in the glass, and the expression in his eyes was one she recognized from her own mirror, the look of someone who had lost everything and was ready to sacrifice anything for justice. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Something I haven't told you yet." "What?" Maxwell isn't just being honored at the Pentagon ceremony. He's being promoted again to 4-star general. The ceremony is supposed to celebrate his heroic actions in Afghanistan, actions that include covering up his own war crimes by claiming he single-handedly eliminated a terrorist cell. The soldiers he murdered. Exactly. He's turned their deaths into his greatest triumph, and after the ceremony he'll be untouchable. 4-star generals don't go to prison, Maggie. They retire with honor and write memoirs about their service. To their country. Rex suddenly spun from the window, his body rigid with attention. He'd heard something, a sound too faint for human ears, but crystal clear to his enhanced senses. "We have company," Maggie said, reaching for her weapon. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Maxwell's people had learned from their mistakes at the diner. This time they weren't taking chances. Flash-bang grenades shattered the windows, filling the cabin with smoke and chaos. Through the confusion, Maggie could hear boots on the porch, commands being shouted, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. But Rex was already moving. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of waiting, 3 years of carrying the burden of murdered soldiers. It all exploded out of him in a fury that was both beautiful and terrifying. He didn't bark or growl. He simply became what he had been trained to be, a weapon designed to eliminate enemies of the United States. The first operative through the door never saw him coming. Rex hit him at knee level, his 70 pounds of muscle and bone driving the man to the floor with devastating force. The second operative tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Rex was already moving, flowing like liquid death through the smoke-filled room. "Sarah, move!" Maggie shouted, laying down covering fire as more operatives poured through the windows. These weren't federal agents or military police. They were private contractors, mercenaries who'd been hired to eliminate witnesses. Rex appeared beside her, blood on his muzzle, but his eyes blazing with purpose. He'd disabled 3 men in less than 30 seconds, and he wasn't done. When Maggie pointed toward the back door, he nodded, actually nodded, and took point, leading them through the chaos toward their escape route. But as they reached the door, a familiar voice cut through the gunfire and smoke. "That's enough." General Maxwell stood in the doorway, his sidearm drawn but pointed at the floor. "Stand down, all of you!" The shooting stopped, but the tension remained electric. Rex positioned himself between Maxwell and the 2 women. His body coiled for attack, but something in Maxwell's posture had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. Resignation. "You want the truth, Mrs. Chen? The real truth?" Maxwell's voice was tired, defeated. "Then let me tell you what really happened in Afghanistan. Let me tell you why that dog has to die." Maxwell's confession came in the pre-dawn darkness, with Rex standing guard and Sarah's camera recording every word. The general sat in the ruins of the safe house, surrounded by his unconscious operatives, and finally told the truth he'd been hiding for 3 years. "It started with good intentions," he said, his voice hollow. "The reconstruction funds were being stolen by Afghan officials, diverted to the Taliban, used to buy weapons that killed our soldiers. I was trying to intercept the money, to use it for actual reconstruction projects." "Bullshit," Maggie spat. "You were lining your own pockets." "At first, yes, but then Williams and his team stumbled onto something bigger. The weapons trafficking wasn't being run by Afghan officials. It was being orchestrated by American contractors, defense companies that were making billions selling arms to both sides of the conflict." Rex's growl deepened, and Maxwell's eyes flicked to the dog nervously. "He knows I'm telling the truth now. Dogs can sense these things, can't they? They know when humans are lying." "Keep talking," Sarah said, her camera never wavering. Williams had evidence that would have brought down half the Pentagon's leadership, exposed a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. But he was young, idealistic. He wanted to do everything by the book, file reports through proper channels. He didn't understand that the proper channels were compromised. Maxwell's hand shook as he reached for a water bottle. I tried to convince him to work with me, to expose the conspiracy carefully, strategically, but he refused. He was going to report everything, including my involvement. He would have destroyed our ability to stop the real criminals. "So you killed him," Maggie said. "I made a choice. 3 soldiers, or hundreds of American lives that would be lost if the weapons trafficking continued. It was a tactical decision." Rex moved closer, his amber eyes boring into Maxwell's soul. The dog's presence seemed to drain the general's remaining composure, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "But I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong about everything. The conspiracy was bigger than I imagined, and my actions just made me part of it. The defense contractors who were supposed to be the real enemy, they recruited me. They made me one of them." "The weapons sales continued," Sarah said. "Accelerated. My silence about Williams and his team was bought with a percentage of every deal. I told myself I was gathering evidence, building a case. but the truth is I became exactly what Williams died trying to expose. Maxwell looked directly at Rex, and tears began streaming down his face. I dream about them every night. Williams, Martinez, Johnson. They visit me in my sleep, asking why I betrayed them. But it's your handler that haunts me most, Rex. David Chen was the best of us, and I had him killed because he got too close to the truth. Rex took another step forward, and Maxwell didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed relieved that his reckoning had finally arrived. The IED that killed David. I gave the order. I told myself it was necessary, that he was going to expose operations that were bigger than any of us. But the truth is, I was protecting myself, my career, my legacy. I sacrificed a good man to save my own skin. And now? Maggie asked, her weapon trained on Maxwell's chest. Now I'm a 4-star general receiving the nation's highest honors for actions that never happened. Tomorrow I'll stand before the president and receive a medal for heroism while the real heroes lie in unmarked graves. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so fucking tragic. Rex had reached Maxwell now, close enough to attack, close enough to deliver the justice he'd been carrying for 3 years. But instead of attacking, the dog did something unexpected. He sat and placed his paw on Maxwell's knee. It wasn't a salute this time. It was forgiveness. Maxwell broke down completely, sobbing like a child as he placed his hand on Rex's scarred head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I'm so sorry. I can't bring them back, but I can make sure their deaths mean something." "How?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell pulled out his phone and began making calls. To his aide-de-camp, cancelling the Pentagon ceremony. To the FBI, requesting a meeting with the director. To the Attorney General, offering to provide evidence in exchange for protection. As Maggie listened to Maxwell systematically destroy his own career and expose the conspiracy that had cost so many lives, she realized that Rex had done something extraordinary. The dog hadn't just been seeking revenge, he'd been seeking redemption. For Maxwell, for the system that had failed, for everyone who had been corrupted by the machinery of war. "There's one more thing," Maxwell said after finishing his calls. He pulled out a military decoration, the Distinguished Service Cross he was supposed to receive the next day. "This belongs to someone else." He pinned the medal to Rex's collar, and the dog accepted it with the dignity of a soldier receiving his due for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy, Maxwell said, reciting the traditional citation. "For exposing corruption at the highest levels of command and bringing justice to fallen comrades at great personal risk." Rex stood and walked to the window, where the first light of dawn was breaking over the Montana mountains. He looked back, and Maggie once, his amber eyes filled with something she'd never seen before. Peace. The war was finally over. The Pentagon ceremony that was supposed to honor General Maxwell instead became a media circus as news of his confession broke. Sarah's video of Maxwell's breakdown went viral within hours, and by evening, every major news network was running the story of the dog who had exposed the biggest military scandal in decades. Rex became an overnight sensation, but not in the way anyone expected. The photographs of him wearing David's medal, standing guard over Maxwell during his confession, leading investigators to burial sites in Montana. They showed a dog who had transcended his training to become something larger than life. "He's not just a war dog," CNN's military correspondent said during a live broadcast. "He's a witness, a guardian, a symbol of everything the military is supposed to represent. While human beings were corrupted by power and greed, this dog never forgot his oath to protect and serve." The congressional hearings that followed were brutal. Maxwell's testimony, corroborated by the evidence Rex had helped David gather, exposed a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. 7 generals were court-martialed, 15 defense contractors were indicted, and the entire military procurement system was overhauled. But it was Rex's presence at the hearings that captured the nation's attention. The dog sat beside Sarah as she testified, occasionally responding to questions with sounds that seemed almost human. When one congressman suggested that a dog's testimony was inadmissible, Rex stood and walked to a photograph of the murdered soldiers, placing his paw on each face in turn. The hearing room fell silent. Even the most cynical politicians understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a dog demanding justice for his fallen packmates. "This animal has shown more integrity than most of the humans in this room," Senator Patricia Walsh said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's kept faith with his dead handler and his murdered comrades for 3 years. The least we can do is listen to what he's trying to tell us." The public response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from veterans, active duty soldiers, and civilians who saw Rex as a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. A petition to award him the Medal of Honor gathered over 2 million signatures in a single week. But perhaps the most powerful response came from the families of Maxwell's victims. Maria Martinez, whose son had been murdered by Maxwell's men, traveled from Texas to Montana to meet Rex personally. "My Carlos loved dogs," she said, kneeling beside Rex in Mel's Diner, which had become an unofficial pilgrimage site. "He always said they were better than people because they never forgot who their friends were. This dog, he remembered my son. He fought for my son when nobody else would." Rex accepted her embrace with the dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal. But Maggie could see the toll the attention was taking on him. He was a soldier, not a celebrity, and the constant crowds and cameras were wearing him down. "He needs to rest," she told Sarah one evening as they watched Rex lying by the fireplace, the medal still gleaming on his collar. "He's carried this burden for 3 years. He deserves some peace." "He's become bigger than both of us," Sarah replied. "The whole country sees him as a hero. How do you give a hero a normal life?" Rex seemed to hear the conversation. He stood and walked to the mantel where David's photograph still held place of honor. For a long moment, he stared at the image of his fallen handler. Then he did something that made both women's eyes fill with tears. He removed the medal from his collar and placed it at the base of David's photograph. Then he lay down and closed, his eyes finally allowing himself to rest. The message was clear. His mission was complete. He had kept faith with the dead, exposed the truth, and brought justice to those who had betrayed their oath. Now it was time to mourn, to heal, and to find peace. 6 months after Maxwell's confession, Maggie stood in Arlington National Cemetery, watching as Rex was officially recognized as a military working dog killed in action, retroactively correcting the records that had listed him as dead for 3 years. The ceremony was small, attended only by the families of Maxwell's victims and a handful of military officials who had survived the corruption purge. Rex wore a new collar now, one that bore the colors of every unit he had served with. He moved, more slowly these days, the weight of his years and his battles finally catching up with him. But his eyes still held that spark of intelligence, that depth of understanding that set him apart from ordinary dogs. "He should be retired," the Army veterinarian had told Maggie. "He's earned it. Most military working dogs don't live this long, and none of them have been through what he has." But retirement meant finding Rex a home, and that was proving more complicated than anyone had expected. He'd bonded with Maggie, but he wasn't really her dog. He'd belonged to David, and David was gone. He'd served his country with distinction, but his country wasn't sure what to do with a dog who knew too many secrets. The solution came from an unexpected source: Maxwell himself. The former general was serving a life sentence in military prison But he'd continued to cooperate with investigators, helping to uncover the full extent of the corruption he'd been part of. In a letter to Maggie, he'd made an unusual request. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you or Rex, but I've been thinking about what would honor the men I killed." Williams always talked about wanting to start a foundation for military working dogs after his service ended. He believed they deserved better care, better treatment, better recognition for their sacrifices. "I've liquidated all my assets, my pension, my investments, everything, to create that foundation. I want Rex to be its first ambassador if he'll accept the role." The foundation had grown beyond Maxwell's initial donation. Corporate sponsors, celebrity endorsements, and grassroots fundraising had created an organization that provided medical care, training, and retirement homes for military working dogs across the country. Rex seemed to understand his new role instinctively. At foundation events, he would seek out the youngest dogs, the ones just beginning their training, and somehow communicate the gravity of their future service. With older dogs, retirement cases like himself, he showed a gentleness that brought tears to the eyes of their handlers. "He's teaching them," Maggie realized during one event. "He's passing on what he's learned." But it was during a visit to a VA hospital that Rex's true calling became clear. The dog moved through the wards like he was conducting reconnaissance, but instead of searching for enemies, he was finding wounded souls. He spent long minutes with each veteran, offering comfort to those who needed it most. One young Marine, a triple amputee who hadn't spoken since returning from Iraq, broke his silence when Rex approached his bedside. "You know, don't you?" the Marine whispered, his hand resting on Rex's scarred head. "You know what it's like to come home different." Rex's response was to place his head on the young man's chest, and for the first time in months, the Marine smiled. "This is where he belongs," Maggie told Sarah later, "not as a celebrity or a symbol, but as a healer. He's figured out how to turn his trauma into something that helps others." Sarah nodded, watching Rex work with a group of PTSD patients. David would be proud. He always said Rex was more than just a dog. He was a guardian angel in disguise. As autumn turned to winter, Rex's visits to the VA hospital became legendary. Nurses would call ahead when they had a particularly difficult case, and somehow the dog always seemed to know exactly what each patient needed. Sometimes it was companionship, sometimes protection, sometimes just the presence of another warrior who understood the cost of service. Maggie had moved closer to the hospital, buying a small house where Rex could have a yard and she could have the peace she'd been seeking since David's death. They'd found a routine that worked for both of them: morning walks, afternoon visits to the hospital, quiet evenings by the fireplace where Rex would rest, and Maggie would read aloud from David's letters. It was during one of these evening sessions that Rex made his final gesture of closure. Maggie was reading from David's journal, entries about his investigation into Maxwell's crimes, when Rex suddenly stood and walked to the bookshelf. He returned carrying something in his mouth, a small wooden box that Maggie had never seen before. Inside, the box was David's wedding ring, his dog tags, and a final letter addressed to Rex himself. "Partner, if you're reading this, well, if Maggie is reading this to you, then you've kept your promise. You've brought justice to our fallen brothers, and you've made sure their deaths weren't meaningless. I couldn't ask for a better partner, a better friend, or a better soldier. Your service is complete. It's time to rest." Rex listened to every word, then gently took David's dog tags in his mouth and carried them to the mantel. He placed them beside the photograph, next to his own medal, and then did something that broke Maggie's heart and healed it at the same time. He saluted. One last perfect military salute, held for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered with the precision of a soldier completing his final duty. When he settled beside Maggie's chair that night, his head resting on her feet, she realized that he wasn't just David's dog anymore. He was hers. They were both veterans, both survivors, both carrying scars that would never fully heal, but they'd found each other, and that was enough. 2 years later, Rex passed peacefully in his sleep, curled up in the patch of sunlight by the living room window where he'd spent his final months watching over Maggie and the steady stream of veterans who'd come to know him as a brother. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Representatives from every branch of the armed forces attended, along with dozens of veterans whose lives Rex had touched during his retirement. The president himself delivered the eulogy, calling Rex a soldier's soldier who never forgot his oath and never abandoned his brothers. But it was Maggie's words, spoken at the graveside as Rex's flag-draped casket was lowered into the earth, that captured the true measure of the dog who had changed everything. Rex taught us that loyalty isn't just about following orders. It's about knowing the difference between right and wrong, and having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. He showed us that honor isn't awarded by medals or ceremonies. It's earned by keeping faith with those who can no longer speak for themselves. As the honor guard fired their final salute and the bugler played taps, a single tear rolled down Maggie's cheek. She placed David's photo next to Rex's headstone, and for the first time in 5 years, she smiled. In the distance, carried on the wind like a final message, came the sound that had defined Rex's life and legacy, not a bark of aggression or fear, but a howl of triumph. Somewhere in whatever place warriors go when their battles are done, Rex had found his pack again. He never barked again, not because he couldn't, but because he had already spoken the truth that needed to be heard. And that truth would echo through the halls of justice forever, carried by all who remembered the dog who refused to let honor die. In loving memory of all military working dogs who have served with honor, and the handlers who loved them. Their sacrifice is never forgotten, their loyalty never questioned, and their courage never diminished by time or distance. They are and always will be the best of us.